Something happened with the world between February 28th and right now that most Americans are only half understanding, and if you are watching this video, it means you already sense that there is far more beneath the surface of what you are being told. So let's talk about it directly, clearly, and without the usual noise. The Strait of Hormuz has been largely blocked since February 28th, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched an air war against Iran and killed its supreme leader Ali Khamenei. And in response to that, Iran did something that no amount of American military hardware could instantly undo. About 20% of the world's oil supply, plus similar or even larger amounts of liquefied natural gas and fertilizer products, must now pass through a narrow strait to reach world markets, and that passage has virtually ceased. Now, the question that nobody in Washington seems to want to answer plainly is this: what happens when China, the single largest buyer of oil on this planet, decides it is done waiting? Beijing imports roughly 40% of its crude oil and 30% of its liquefied natural gas through this narrow 54-kilometer waterway. That is not a trade inconvenience. That is an existential pressure on the Chinese industrial machine. And China just started moving ships with an escort, and that tells you everything you need to know about where this is really heading. Now let's go deeper, because this is where most of the mainstream coverage stops and where the real story actually begins. When the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps first moved to assert control of the strait, they transmitted warnings via VHF radio to vessels stating that no ship was allowed to pass. On March 2nd, the IRGC officially confirmed the strait was closed to what they called unfriendly nations, and by March 4th, Iranian authorities claimed complete control of the waterway. So you have to hold that image in your mind. The most consequential maritime choke point on Earth, a body of water through which roughly a fifth of all global oil flows, was essentially locked, and the world's economies started feeling it almost immediately. Oil prices posted their largest ever monthly gain in March in the wake of what the International Energy Agency called the most severe oil supply shock in history. Let that sink in for a moment. The largest monthly oil price gain ever recorded in human history. This is not a regional conflict anymore. This is a global economic disruption of historic proportions, and your gas station, your grocery store, your heating bill, all of it is connected to that narrow strip of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. Now, what did China do from the very beginning of all this? China did what China always does when it is being squeezed. It played both sides of the chessboard simultaneously. Several Iran-approved ships passed through the strait during the conflict, mostly petroleum ships bound for China and India, some with military escort. So even while the world's shipping firms were suspending operations and insurance companies were raising premiums to eye-watering levels, Chinese vessels were still moving. Iran had created a priority list, a kind of geopolitical velvet rope, and China was on the approved side. Why? Because China was buying Iran's oil massively. According to data, China bought more than 80% of Iran's shipped oil last year, with Chinese imports of Iranian crude reaching 1.4 million barrels per day, out of a total 10.4 million barrels of seaborne crude imports per day. This relationship between Beijing and Tehran is not sentimental. It is transactional in the purest sense of the word. Iran needed buyers willing to absorb oil under sanctions. China needed cheap oil to fuel its manufacturing base. The relationship worked because both sides got what they wanted, and the United States either could not or would not fully stop it. And here is the part that reveals something profound about how the global system actually operates versus how we are told it operates. China's customs records show zero imports from Iran since 2022, yet its recorded Malaysian crude imports in 2025 reached 1.3 million barrels per day, more than double Malaysia's entire production. Read that again. China was officially importing no Iranian oil, officially, but mathematically, someone was pouring 1.3 million barrels a day of mysteriously labeled Malaysian oil into the Chinese market from a country that simply does not produce anywhere near that volume. The shadow fleet, the spoofed transponders, the flags of landlocked nations flying on tankers at sea, this entire architecture of evasion has been running for years in plain sight, and with tacit tolerance from enough power centers to keep it functional. Then came the blockade. On April 13, 2026, following the failure of the Islamabad talks during the ceasefire, the United States imposed a naval blockade on Iran, with Trump announcing that the U.S. Navy would prevent ships from entering or exiting the strait and intercept ships that had paid tolls to Iran, and almost instantly, China moved to test it. 20 minutes after the U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports took effect on Monday evening, A Chinese-owned tanker called the MV Rich Starry pulled out of anchorage near Sharjah and headed for the Strait of Hormuz. It was flying a Malawian flag, an interesting choice for a landlocked country. Its AIS transponder had been spoofing its position for 11 days. It carried roughly 250,000 barrels of methanol, officially loaded at a UAE port, and almost certainly originating from Iran. Think about what that sequence of events tells you. The ink on the blockade announcement was barely dry, and a Chinese-flagged vessel, sanctioned, flagged under a landlocked nation's colors, with a transponder that had been lying about its location for over a week, was already making its move. The Rich Starry, owned by Shanghai Zhuanrun Shipping, was among more than a half-dozen vessels which attempted to cross the strait on the first day of the blockade, and critically, it was broadcasting something that says everything about the nature of this confrontation. Newsweek's review of automatic identification system data showed the Rich Starry was broadcasting the phrase China owners and crew when it began its voyage out of the strait. China owners and crew, not a shipping company name, not a cargo designation. A national identity declaration, broadcast on open channels to U.S. naval forces who were watching every single ship in that waterway. That is not a commercial decision. That is a political statement transmitted at sea. And Beijing made its position even clearer through official channels. China's defense minister Dong Jun stated, "We have trade and energy agreements with Iran. We expect others not to interfere in our affairs. The Strait of Hormuz is open to us." China's foreign ministry simultaneously condemned the U.S. naval blockade as dangerous and irresponsible, warning against any effort to obstruct Chinese vessels. So you have the Chinese defense minister making a territorial claim over a waterway controlled by American warships, and you have Chinese tankers literally broadcasting their national ownership in the middle of a naval standoff. This is not routine commercial shipping behavior. This is a coordinated message, and the message is, we dare you. Now look at the American side of the ledger, because the blockade itself is not as airtight as the Pentagon's press releases suggest. The U.S. has assembled its largest naval force since 2003, 3 carrier strike groups, 21 warships, over 100 aircraft, and 10,000 personnel. That is an enormous commitment of resources, but enormous does not mean invincible. Naval experts noted that a basic escort operation would need between 8 to 10 destroyers to protect convoys of between 5 to 10 commercial vessels per transit. The U.S. has 73 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers on active duty, but only about 68% of U.S. surface ships are combat-ready at any given time, dispersed around the globe. So the math of a sustained blockade against a determined adversary with a shadow fleet, diplomatic cover, and the ability to move ships under false flags is far more complicated than any presidential tweet or Pentagon briefing conveys. Vessel traffic through the Strait of Hormuz is less than 10% of its pre-war average of about 138 transits per day, and even with American destroyers physically in the strait, ships are still getting through. This is where the conversation about China's convoy of more than 20 ships with naval escort stops, being about logistics, and starts being about something far more significant. Because China does not improvise at this level, China plans. China has been running naval escort missions in the Gulf of Aden for years. The People's Liberation Army Navy already operates a heavily fortified naval base in nearby Djibouti on the Horn of Africa and has years of experience conducting anti-piracy escort missions in the Gulf of Aden. Expanding these operations to actively escort Chinese-flagged commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz is a logical, highly feasible escalation of their current maritime capabilities. What you are watching unfold right now is not an improvised response to a crisis. It is the operationalization of a capability China has been quietly building for years, waiting for exactly the kind of moment that would justify deploying it openly. And there is the deeper geopolitical architecture underneath all of this that you need to understand. China's moves in the Strait of Hormuz are not simply about this particular shipment of oil or this particular moment of tension with the United States. They are about establishing precedent. Every time a Chinese vessel transits the strait under Chinese naval protection in defiance of a U.S. blockade, Beijing is making a statement to the entire developing world. We can protect your commerce. We can guarantee your energy supply chains. The United States cannot stop us, and it will not stop you if you align with us. That is the pitch. That is the sales presentation being made in real time, at sea, with warships. The blockade does not need to stop every barrel. It needs to make the cost of continuing the trade higher than the cost of stopping it, and it needs to present Beijing with a menu in which every option serves American interests. China can confront the U.S. Navy, running tankers through the blockade and daring destroyers to board them. This would crater energy markets and risk military escalation. But China also holds cards that Washington does not fully want to acknowledge. China holds 1.3 billion barrels in strategic reserves, enough for 120 days. Beijing can survive without Iranian crude, which means China's decision to keep moving ships through the strait is not purely driven by desperation. It is being driven by strategic calculation. China can absorb the energy hit if it needs to, but it has chosen instead to push back, to test, to probe, to signal, because backing down completely in the face of an American naval blockade would cost Beijing something far more valuable than oil. It would cost them their standing as an alternative pole of global power. Now look at the Treasury Secretary's response to all of this, because it reveals the bind Washington finds itself in. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called China an unreliable partner for holding onto its oil instead of helping ease the global shortage caused by Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Think about that framing for a moment. The United States went to war against Iran, with Israel, killed Iran's supreme leader, closed the most important oil transit route on Earth, and then called China unreliable for not volunteering to ease the resulting global oil shortage. China is not an American logistics provider. China is a sovereign competitor that is watching American overextension with considerable strategic patience and considerable strategic interest, and the IMF is already sounding alarms that should concern every American household. The International Monetary Fund says the global economy is facing a major test from the outbreak of war in the Middle East, projecting global growth will slow to 3.1% in 2026 and 3.2% in 2027 if conflict remains limited in duration and scope. If it does not remain limited, those numbers get significantly worse, and right now the trajectory of events, a US naval blockade, Chinese vessels pushing through with naval escorts, Iranian mines still uncleared from the strait, diplomacy stalled, after the Islamabad talks collapsed, does not look like a situation racing toward limitation. It looks like a situation finding new floors of escalation every week. The American public deserves to understand what is actually at stake in that 54-kilometer strip of water. This is not a distant naval exercise. This is the artery through which global energy flows. It is the pressure point through which the economic relationship between the old American-led order and the emerging China-centered alternative is being tested in real time, with warships, with mines, with spoofed transponders, and with political declarations broadcast on open radio frequencies. China cannot afford the geopolitical embarrassment of relying on American or European warships to protect its sovereign vessels and secure its energy lifeline. Deploying its own naval assets ensures China maintains an independent power projection in the Indian Ocean and the Gulf. That is the real story. China is not sending 20-plus ships through the Hormuz with an escort because it panicked. China is doing it because the Strait of Hormuz just became the most visible stage on Earth for the most consequential argument of our time. Who runs the global order? And Beijing has decided very deliberately, very publicly, that its answer to that question is going to be written in the language the whole world understands: the movement of warships in contested waters.